Throughout the centuries, there were many different executioners whose job it was to perform the bloody and horrific deaths of criminals who were condemned. A number of executioners were well known, for example Jack Ketch, who is remembered for being a botching axeman who, despite working in London executing dozens of people, he performed 2 executions that went very wrong. Ketch tried to take the head of the Duke of Monmouth, James Scott, the son of King Charles II, who tried to rebel against King James II. But it took Ketch a huge number of swings of the axe to take Monmouth's head, and he even gave up following one of these. He had to finish the job off with a knife, and his actions caused a riot, almost, and they wanted to execute Ketch next, as the people expected an execution to be carried out in a dignified way. But he was forced to write an apology for his actions, but most of the executioners were men. But there was a woman in history who was known to have carried out executions, and her name was Lady Betty, and she was sometimes referred to as Jill O Ketch. But what is the story of the female executioner? Elizabeth Serge, or Liz Sugar as she was known, was born in the mid-18th century, around 1740, and she would be remembered for being one of the only recorded female executioners. She was married to a farmer, but after his death she was left poor and she was destitute. Because of this, she was evicted from her home with her 2 children, and she was forced to go to Rose Common, where she would then try to live. But one of her children suffered from starvation to the point where he died on the long walk, and this left her with only one child, her eldest son. But her relationship with Padraig, this child, was not the strongest, and he had a violent temper, and he tried to leave home a lot. But each time, Elizabeth would beg him to remain, as she was worried about being alone. Following one argument in the April of 1775, he left Elizabeth and joined up with the British Army, or he may have also moved to North America, becoming part of the Continental Army. But for Elizabeth, things were very tough, and she was very withdrawn, and she tried to take in lodgers and to raise some money, but she did not hear much from her son, and she became worried and angry at the world. But there was a rumour in 1789 where a man who came to stay in her house as a lodger was murdered. Elizabeth, who was slowly losing her mind, murdered this man, and it was claimed that this man may have either been her long-lost son who caused problems, but for this crime she was arrested and was then convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Elizabeth was then held inside of the old jail in Rose Common alongside many other condemned people, and there were 25 who were awaiting their death sentence, and this included criminals of varying degree, including thieves and sheep and cattle rustlers. A few had even been condemned for tearing down fences leading to private land. But for Elizabeth Serge, she would have a rather bizarre stay of execution that saw her become the person who would perform the bloody job of executing these criminals. On the day of her execution, the hangman inside of the town was said to have been unfit to perform his job and duty as he was very ill, and because of this there was no hangman to condemn Rose Common's criminals, including Elizabeth. But many criminals would be forced throughout history to work as executioners, and many would escape the death penalty if they would become involved in the job of condemning others. And many of the executioners inside of towns and cities were actually convicted criminals who regained some respect by doing this job. But Elizabeth would be offered the job of an executioner, as 3 others refused this, and with this she managed to escape her own execution. She was allegedly given a huge upgrade to her life despite the fact she was a murderer, as her run-down home was not hers anymore, and she was given better lodgings in more comfort inside of Rose Common's prison. Whilst here she had a good standard of living and earned a solid wage executing people, but she also had company which she greatly wanted. She rubbed shoulders with the prison staff and had regular warm meals and access to good facilities. Executioners in towns became a local celebrity, and people would flock to Rose Common to hear of the female executioner. But inside of the prison, Elizabeth also went further, as she would be involved in torture and beatings, and she would also be called into the flog. prisoners for punishment using a whip in front of other inmates. However, the original hangman died from his illness and Elizabeth took his job and she became known as Lady Betty, Rose Common's official executioner. She lived in comfort in the jail and would, following executions, draw images of what she had just done to remind her of her work, and she also had a garden that she would tend to. But she executed a number of people who were high profile, including in 1798 a number of Irish rebels who protested British rule, and the executions were carried out in public to keep the people in Rose Common from thinking about joining uprising and rebellions. However, she continued as the executioner inside of the town for many years until 1802. Her death sentence was actually officially commuted due to the work she had performed inside of the town. She was said to have served the public well, but she wasn't the first woman to become an executioner. As in Ireland in 1782, an anonymous Irish woman hanged 2 men who had been sentenced to death for murder at Kilmainham. The men here were also quartered after their ordeal, and this woman may have performed the bloody part of this execution. But the sheriff was forced to change his executioner as he got a lot of controversy for having a woman perform the job. But in 1807, Lady Betty was killed as she was murdered by an inmate inside of Rose Common Jail. She was by this time a rather elderly lady, and one account says that she was struck by a prisoner who in his hand was armed with a rock. Liz had been keeping an eye on this prisoner as he was working hard, and he lost it and attacked her. But other accounts say she died from natural causes and old age. However, the story of Lady Betty, Ireland's female executioner, is a captivating one, and she was well known inside of Ireland for her job as a hangwoman, and she was considered skilled, but it was rare throughout the years to find a woman acting in this capacity and role, and to be someone who would take the lives of others in front of huge crowds. But by becoming the executioner of Rose Common, Lady Betty became a woman who was relieved of her own death sentence. And let's remember, she was a murderer after all, but she then became a woman who was legally tasked with taking the lives of others who had been condemned. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.